My name is Meredith. I am 33 years old, and I spent my entire life watching my parents fund my older brother's lavish lifestyle while telling me to fend for myself. When they happily handed him a $60,000 check for a down payment on a mansion and told me to just go rent a studio somewhere, I did not throw a tantrum. I simply walked away, used my own savings to secretly buy my first distressed property, and started building an invisible real estate empire. I had no idea that a few years later, my family's financial recklessness would lead them to unknowingly lose everything to my holding company, setting the stage for the most satisfying unmasking of my life. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Chicago, the dynamic in my family was established early and enforced daily. My father Richard and my mother Patricia made no secret of their preferences. My older brother Connor was the golden child, the boy who could do no wrong, the heir apparent to whatever imaginary throne my parents believed they sat upon. I was merely the sensible, quiet daughter who was expected to manage on her own. I learned to be self-sufficient because I had no other choice. While Connor received brand new cars and fully funded college experiences, I worked retail jobs to pay for my textbooks and drove a reliable used Honda Civic that I bought myself. Despite the clear favoritism, I still held on to a naive hope that my parents would eventually honor their word if I proved myself responsible enough. That lingering hope was finally shattered on a chilly Thursday evening inside one of downtown Chicago's most exclusive steakhouses. The restaurant was a fortress of dark wood, dim lighting, and soft jazz, the kind of place where the prices are not listed on the menu and the waiters wear white gloves. I sat at a large circular table, nursing a simple glass of tap water while my family celebrated around me. The occasion was supposedly a generic family dinner, but the celebratory atmosphere felt suspiciously specific. My parents had ordered 2 bottles of imported champagne before the appetizers even arrived. Connor sat across from me looking incredibly smug in a tailored suit he could barely afford. Next to him sat his wife, Brittany. Brittany was a woman who demanded luxury as if it were a basic human right, constantly complaining about the hardships of living in their perfectly fine suburban rental. They had been pushing my parents for financial help to buy a home for months, citing the need for more space to start a family, even though they had no children yet. I worked as a commercial real estate appraiser, a career I loved and excelled at. My job required a sharp eye for value, a deep understanding of market trends, and a completely objective mindset. I spent my days assessing multi-million-dollar properties, analyzing zoning laws, and predicting neighborhood gentrification. I made a solid income, but I lived well below my means. I stayed in a tiny apartment, cooked my own meals, and saved every spare dollar. My goal was simple. I wanted to buy my own modest townhouse. 3 years prior to this dinner, my parents had made me a promise. It was not just a passing comment, but a verbal agreement we had discussed at length. My father had looked me in the eye and said that if I could prove my financial discipline by saving $30,000 on my own, he and my mother would match it. They promised to give me $30,000 toward my down payment as a reward for my hard work. I had taken that promise to heart. I sacrificed vacations, ignored the latest fashion trends, and worked overtime to reach that goal. Just 2 weeks before this dinner, I had finally hit the $45,000 mark in my savings account. I had far exceeded their requirement and was ready to start looking for my first home. As the waiter cleared our main courses, the ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to fade away. My father cleared his throat, commanding the attention of the table. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a long, crisp, rectangular piece of paper. He beamed with pride as he looked at Connor. "Your mother and I know how hard you and Brittany have been working to find the perfect home." My father announced, his voice carrying a tone of grand benevolence. "We know the market is tough right now, and we want to ensure our future grandchildren have the spacious backyard and the safe, upscale neighborhood they deserve." My mother smiled warmly, her manicured hands clasped together under her chin. "We are just so proud of the man you have become, Connor. You have a family to lead, and a leader needs a proper castle. With a dramatic flourish, my father slid the paper across the white tablecloth. It was a cashier's check. Even from my position across the table, I could clearly read the bold printed numbers. It was a check for $60,000. Connor snatched the check from the table, his eyes widening in triumphant delight. He let out a loud laugh, holding the paper up for Brittany to see. Brittany clapped her hands, though her expression quickly shifted into a slight pout. "Thank you so much, Richard," Brittany said, her voice dripping with an artificial sweetness that always grated on my nerves. "This is a lovely start. Of course, $60,000 barely covers the 20% down payment for the neighborhoods we are looking at in the northern suburbs, but it will certainly help us secure the mortgage. We really deserve a place with at least 4 bedrooms and a modern kitchen." I sat perfectly still, my hands resting in my lap. I felt a cold, heavy sensation settle in my stomach. $30,000. They were handing him double the amount they had promised to match for me, and they were doing it without him ever having to save a single dime of his own money. Connor was notorious for his reckless spending. He had zero financial discipline, massive credit card debt, and a lifestyle completely funded by his inflated sense of entitlement. Yet here they were, rewarding his irresponsibility with a massive financial bailout. I took a slow, deep breath, trying to keep my voice as steady and professional as possible. I looked directly at my father. "That is a very generous gift, Dad," I said calmly. "Since we are on the topic of real estate and down payments, I wanted to share some good news as well. I finally reached my savings goal last week. I actually surpassed it. I have $45,000 saved up. So according to our agreement from 3 years ago, I am ready for the matching funds to start looking at townhouses." The silence that fell over the table was sudden and thick. Connor rolled his eyes and let out a heavy sigh, as if my mere presence was an exhausting burden. Brittany focused intensely on her manicured nails, pretending I had not spoken. My mother looked at me, her expression shifting instantly from warm maternal pride to cold annoyance. She let out a loud, harsh scoff and waved her hand in the air to dismiss my words entirely. "Oh, Meredith, please do not be so dramatic," my mother said, her tone dripping with condescension. "That conversation was years ago. Things change. Financial situations change. We just gave your brother a very large sum of money. You cannot possibly expect us to write another check right now." "But we had an agreement," I replied, refusing to break eye contact. I held up my end of the bargain. I worked hard and sacrificed for 3 years to prove I was responsible. My mother sighed loudly, exchanging a tired look with my father. "You are single, Meredith. You do not need a house. It is ridiculous for a single woman to buy property all alone. Just rent a studio somewhere in the city. It is much more practical for your lifestyle. Connor is a man with a wife. He has a family to think about. He needs a real house. You just need a place to sleep between your long hours at work." The words hung in the air. Before I could respond, Connor leaned across the table and snatched the cashier's check from the crisp white linen. He held it up to the dim light like a winning lottery ticket, a wide smirk spreading across his face. He folded the check and tucked it into his expensive suit jacket, which I knew he had purchased on a maxed-out credit card. He looked at me with that familiar patronizing expression he had perfected since we were teenagers. "Come on, Meredith. Try to be happy for us for once," Connor said, swirling his imported champagne. "Real estate investment at this level is really a man's game anyway. You do a great job assessing other people's properties, but actually owning a substantial family estate requires a different kind of mindset. You should just stick to your spreadsheets and let me handle the real investments." I stared at him, astonished by his audacity. He was lecturing me about real estate while pocketing a massive handout because he lacked the discipline to save a single dollar. I spent my entire professional life evaluating commercial real estate markets, analyzing property values, and understanding the intricate mechanics of equity and leverage. Connor worked in middle management, a job my father secured for him, and spent his income on leased sports cars he could not afford. Yet in his mind, and clearly in the minds of my parents, his gender and his marital status somehow made him the definitive authority on property ownership. Before I could point out his hypocrisy, Brittany chimed in, her tone shifting to a genuine complaint. "Connor is absolutely right," she said, adjusting her designer necklace. And honestly, Richard's $60,000 will barely cover the minimum down payment for the neighborhoods we are looking at. The housing market is just completely unreasonable right now. We cannot settle for some cramped three-bedroom house. We absolutely need 4 bedrooms, a dedicated home office for Connor, a chef's kitchen for entertaining, and it has to be in the premier school district. We deserve a home that reflects our lifestyle, and 60,000 is just a drop in the bucket for the properties we deserve. I watched my parents nod in agreement, completely validating her complaints. They had just handed over a fortune, and Brittany was already complaining it was not enough to fund their extravagant lifestyle. My parents did not bat an eye. They did not lecture Brittany about living within her means or suggest Connor skip his golf trips. They simply accepted her demands as perfectly reasonable expectations for their golden child and his wife. The conversation transitioned away from my ignored savings goal and moved into an enthusiastic discussion about the high-end finishes Brittany wanted. I sat in silence drinking my tap water, feeling a profound sense of isolation. I was sitting at a table with my immediate family, yet I had never felt more like a stranger. The realization was sharp and undeniable. No amount of financial responsibility, professional success, or quiet obedience would ever make them look at me the way they looked at Connor. I was fighting a battle I had already lost the day I was born. As the evening finally began to wind down, our waiter approached the table. He carried a sleek black leather folder containing the dinner bill. We had eaten at one of the most expensive steakhouses in the city. Between the dry-aged steaks, the multiple rounds of signature cocktails, the 2 bottles of premium vintage champagne my parents had ordered to celebrate Connor, and the decadent desserts, I knew the total was going to be exorbitant. The waiter paused for a brief moment, likely trying to determine who the host of the evening was before stepping toward my father. My father reached out his hand, but he did not take the folder to pay. Instead, he placed his fingertips on top of the black leather and smoothly slid the folder across the smooth white tablecloth directly until it came to a complete stop right in front of my plate. I looked down at the folder, then looked up at my father in absolute confusion. "Well, Meredith," my father said, leaning back and wiping his mouth with his cloth napkin, "since your mother and I just made a very substantial contribution to your brother's future, and since you clearly do not have a mortgage to worry about anytime soon, we think it is only fair that you pick up the check tonight. It is the perfect opportunity for you to treat the family and celebrate your brother's big milestone." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, but his expression was completely serious. I glanced over at my mother. She was smiling brightly, nodding her head in enthusiastic agreement, as if my father had just suggested a brilliant, heartwarming idea. Connor was already reaching for his jacket, completely unbothered by the fact that our father had just demanded I pay for a lavish celebration I had zero part in planning. I reached out and slowly opened the leather folder. The printed receipt stared back at me. The total came to exactly $840. I looked at the itemized list. My side salad and my tap water cost a total of $18. The rest of the bill was entirely composed of their extravagant steaks, their expensive side dishes, and the imported champagne they had used to toast the $60,000 check they had just handed to my brother. They wanted me to pay $840 to subsidize a celebration of my own financial exclusion. The sheer audacity of the request was breathtaking. They had just explicitly refused to honor a 3-year-old financial promise to me, handed my brother a massive unearned fortune, insulted my lifestyle, belittled my career, and now they expected me to empty my checking account to buy them dinner. I slowly closed the black leather folder. I did not push it back across the table, nor did I reach for my purse. I kept my hands resting quietly in my lap, feeling a sudden intense wave of absolute clarity wash over me. The lingering hopes I had harbored for years evaporated in that exact second. "I am not paying this bill, Dad," I stated. My voice was incredibly calm, devoid of any anger, frustration, or sadness. It was the steady, objective tone I used when delivering a difficult property appraisal to a demanding client. My father frowned, his eyebrows pulling together in displeasure. "Do not be selfish, Meredith," he warned, his voice dropping to a low register. "This is a special night for your brother. You have $45,000 sitting in the bank doing nothing. You can afford to buy your family a nice dinner." I looked directly into his eyes, refusing to look away. I can afford many things, I replied evenly. But as Mom pointed out a few minutes ago, I am a single woman who needs to be practical about my finances. My studio rent budget does not cover an $800 dinner with vintage champagne. I did not drink for a down payment I am not receiving. I am happy to pay the $18 for my salad, but the rest is yours. You promised to match my savings and you broke your promise tonight. So no, I will not be treating anyone to dinner. The silence that followed my refusal was so absolute that I could hear the faint clinking of silverware from the tables across the dining room. My father stared at me, his jaw tightening. He expected immediate compliance, especially when he used his authoritative tone. For a brief moment, I saw genuine confusion in his eyes. He truly could not comprehend why I was not eagerly reaching for my wallet to subsidize his generosity toward Connor. Connor broke the silence with a loud, incredulous scoff. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. Are you really doing this right now, Meredith? You are making a huge scene over a dinner bill. I just got the keys to my family's future and you are acting like a spoiled child. I kept my voice perfectly level. I am not making a scene, Connor. I am simply declining to pay for a celebration that has absolutely nothing to do with me. You are the one who just received $60,000. If anyone should be treating the family tonight, it is you. Brittany let out a dramatic gasp, placing a hand over her chest, as if I had just insulted her on a deeply personal level. She looked at my mother, her eyes wide with manufactured outrage. Patricia, I cannot believe she is trying to ruin our special night. We just wanted to have a peaceful family dinner to celebrate this amazing milestone, and now she is being incredibly hostile. My mother's face flushed an angry shade of red. She slammed her palm flat against the tablecloth, causing the crystal water glasses to rattle. Meredith, that is quite enough, she hissed, leaning forward so her voice would not carry to the neighboring tables. You are embarrassing us in front of the waitstaff. You are embarrassing us in front of your brother and your sister-in-law. If you cannot behave like a supportive member of this family, then perhaps you should not be included in future family events. We do not need this kind of toxic, selfish energy ruining our celebrations. If you walk away from this bill, do not expect an invitation to Thanksgiving or Christmas this year. The threat hung heavy in the air, designed to strike terror into my heart. For my entire life, the ultimate punishment in our household was the threat of exclusion. My parents weaponized family gatherings, using invitations as a measure of our compliance and their approval. In the past, the mere suggestion of being uninvited to a holiday dinner would have sent me scrambling to apologize, eager to smooth over the tension and beg for forgiveness. I would have swallowed my pride and spent the next 3 weeks eating instant noodles just to keep the peace. But as I looked at my mother's furious face, I realized that the threat no longer held any power over me. The fear of being excluded had completely vanished. Why would I want to attend a Thanksgiving dinner where I would inevitably be mocked for my modest lifestyle, while Connor bragged about his massive new house? Why would I want to spend Christmas listening to Brittany complain about her luxury kitchen appliances while I worried about paying my heating bill? They were threatening to take away something I no longer wanted. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or attempt to defend my position. I simply reached down and picked up my small leather purse from the floor beside my chair. I unzipped the main compartment and pulled out my wallet. The movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely calm. I opened the wallet and withdrew a crisp $50 bill. I placed the money onto the white tablecloth right next to my half-empty water glass. That covers my $18 salad, my tap water, and a very generous tip for the waiter, I said, making sure my enunciation was perfectly clear. I highly recommend the dry-aged ribeye, Dad. It looks delicious. I am sure you and Connor can figure out how to split the remaining $800. Have a wonderful evening and congratulations on the new house. I stood up from my chair, pushing it neatly back under the table. My father's face was a portrait of stunned disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. My mother stared at the $50 bill as if it were a venomous snake resting on her table. Connor and Brittany were frozen, completely unprepared for a reality where I did not immediately cave to parental pressure. I turned my back on them and walked away. I moved through the elegant dining room with a steady, confident stride. I passed tables of laughing couples and celebrating families, the soft jazz music blending with the low hum of conversation. I did not look over my shoulder. I did not wait for a final parting insult or a sudden apology. I simply walked out the front doors of the steakhouse and stepped into the crisp, cool air of the Chicago evening. The valet brought my car around to the front entrance. My 10-year-old Honda Civic looked out of place idling next to the sleek Mercedes and Range Rovers lining the upscale restaurant parking lot. The valet held the door open, his expression neutral. I thanked him, handed him a tip, and slid into the driver's seat. The familiar scent of old fabric and faint vanilla air freshener greeted me, a sharp contrast to the overwhelming perfume Brittany had been wearing all evening. I closed the car door, sealing myself inside the quiet, private space of my vehicle. I put the keys in the ignition, but I did not start the engine. I sat there in the parking lot, bathed in the soft orange glow of the streetlights. I waited for the tears to come. I expected the familiar sting behind my eyes, the tight lump in my throat, the overwhelming wave of sadness that usually accompanied my family's rejection. But my eyes remained completely dry. My breathing was steady and even. My heart rate was slow and calm. There was no grief. There was no heartbreak. There was only a profound sense of purpose. I reached into my purse and pulled out my smartphone. The screen illuminated the dark interior of the car. I tapped the screen, navigating past my messages, and opened my mobile banking app. The facial recognition scanned my features and the account dashboard loaded instantly. I stared at the bold green numbers displayed at the top of the screen. $45,000. It was a modest sum in the grand scheme of commercial real estate, but to me it represented 3 years of disciplined sacrifice and relentless hard work. It was my freedom. My parents had told me to just rent a studio somewhere. They had dismissed my value and funded my brother's extravagance. In that quiet car, looking at my savings, I made a silent, unbreakable vow. I would never ask them for a single dime again. I would never seek their approval or wait for their validation. I was not going to buy a small townhouse anymore. I was going to take my $45,000 and build an empire that would cast a shadow over their world. I put the car in drive, pulled out of the parking lot, and set the gears of my future into motion. The drive back to my apartment was a blur of city lights and shifting shadows. I navigated the busy Chicago streets with a steady hand, the rhythmic hum of my old car serving as a grounding force. I had expected the adrenaline to fade and be replaced by the crushing weight of rejection, but that moment never arrived. Instead, the further I drove from that upscale steakhouse, the lighter my chest felt. For my entire adult life, I had been operating under the illusion that my parents' respect could be earned through obedience and financial prudence. I had believed that if I played by their rules, I would eventually be granted a seat at the table. Tonight had proven that the table was rigged, and the seats were reserved exclusively for those willing to play the role of the dependent, grateful child. I realized with startling clarity that if they had actually written me that matching check for $30,000, they would have owned a piece of my future. They would have demanded a spare key to my townhouse, criticized my choice of paint colors, and reminded me at every family gathering that I was living under a roof they helped build. By denying me the money, they had unknowingly severed the last remaining string that tied my self-worth to their approval. They had set me completely free. I pulled into the narrow alleyway behind my apartment building and parked in my designated spot. The brick exterior of the building was weathered, and the security light above the back door flickered unsteadily. I climbed the 3 flights of stairs to my unit, the wooden steps creaking under my weight in a familiar, comforting rhythm. When I unlocked my front door and stepped inside, the stark contrast between my living situation and the world my brother was about to enter was undeniable. My apartment was barely 600 square feet. The furnishings were a collection of secondhand pieces I had meticulously restored myself. It was humble, practical, and incredibly cheap. I had sacrificed square footage and modern amenities for years, funneling every spare dollar into my savings account to reach the goal my parents had set for me. I locked the deadbolt behind me, dropped my keys into the small ceramic bowl by the door, and slipped off my heels. The quiet isolation of my apartment, which had sometimes felt lonely in the past, now felt like a fortress. I walked into my small kitchen, filled the kettle with water, and turned on the stove. While I waited for the water to boil, I stripped off the formal dress I had worn to dinner. It was a conservative dark blue dress I had chosen specifically to look responsible and mature, a visual plea to be taken seriously as an adult. I changed into a faded college sweatshirt and comfortable sweatpants, physically shedding the persona of the dutiful, aspiring daughter. I was done dressing the part for an audience that refused to watch the play. I poured myself a cup of tea and carried it over to the small, scratched wooden desk I used as my home office. I opened my laptop and woke the screen. For the past 6 months, my desktop background had been a rotating gallery of modest residential townhouses in the suburbs. They were safe, predictable properties with manageable homeowner association fees and decent resale value. I had spent countless evenings analyzing property taxes, calculating commute times, and dreaming of the day I would finally have a guest room. I opened the digital folder I had meticulously organized my housing research. I highlighted every single document, every saved listing, and every neighborhood profile. With a single press of the delete key, I wiped the folder clean. The dream of the safe suburban townhouse was dead buried alongside my need for my parents' validation. I leaned back in my chair and took a sip of my tea, letting the warmth spread through my chest. I thought about Connor and Brittany. They were probably still at the restaurant ordering another bottle of expensive champagne to celebrate their new mansion. They were about to take on a massive mortgage they could barely afford, relying entirely on my parents' financial cushion to support their extravagant lifestyle. They were stepping into a beautiful gilded cage. I decided in that moment that I was going to do the exact opposite. I was not going to buy a primary residence that would tie up all my capital and bind me to a 30-year loan. I was going to use my money to buy leverage. I opened a new blank spreadsheet and pulled up the commercial and distressed property databases I used for my job as an appraiser. My professional access gave me a distinct advantage. I could see the raw data, the historical trends, and the hidden potential that average residential buyers completely overlooked. I started running the numbers. I had $45,000 in liquid cash. If I purchased a standard single-family home, that money would be entirely consumed by a traditional 20% down payment and closing costs. But if I shifted my strategy, the possibilities expanded exponentially. I began filtering the database for multi-unit properties in neighborhoods that were just beginning to show signs of gentrification. Areas where city planners were quietly investing in infrastructure, where artists and students were moving in looking for cheaper rent, and where property values were poised for a significant upward swing within the next 5 years. The math laid itself out on the bright screen in front of me, clear and undeniable. I did not need to put down 20%. I could utilize an owner-occupied loan program designed for smaller multifamily buildings. If I purchased a duplex or a triplex and lived in one of the units myself, I could secure the property with a down payment as low as 3.5%. That strategy would only require a fraction of my savings, leaving the vast majority of my $45,000 completely untouched. I could use that remaining capital as a dedicated renovation fund. I could buy a property that was severely undervalued due to cosmetic neglect or poor management, move into the worst unit, and rent out the others. The rental income from my tenants would cover the monthly mortgage payments, the property taxes, and the insurance. I would essentially be living for free while simultaneously building equity in an appreciating asset. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I built out the financial models. I projected cash flows, estimated renovation budgets for paint, flooring, and basic fixtures, and calculated the potential return on investment. The excitement I felt was completely different from the quiet hope I had harbored earlier that evening. This was not a passive dream relying on someone else's generosity. This was an active, aggressive strategy that I controlled entirely. I was charting a course that would turn my modest savings into a self-sustaining financial engine. I worked straight through the night, fueled by a potent combination of adrenaline and absolute clarity. I realized that my greatest advantage was the very thing my family mocked me for. They thought I was a sad single woman, living a small, insignificant life. They believed my lack of a husband and a large house made me a failure. I decided to lean into their delusion. I would let them keep their narrative. I would continue to drive my old Honda. I would continue to live quietly and frugally. I would attend their holiday dinners, smile politely, and listen to them brag about their designer clothes and luxury vehicles. I would let them believe that I was exactly who they thought I was. But underneath that carefully maintained facade, I would be building an invisible empire. Every time they insulted my career, I would buy another property. Every time they handed Connor another bailout, I would increase my cash flow. Every time they told me to just rent a studio somewhere, I would expand my portfolio. I would become the master of my own universe, operating entirely in the shadows, amassing power and wealth that they could not even begin to comprehend. By the time the first rays of morning sunlight began to filter through the blinds of my small apartment window, my blueprint was complete. I closed the laptop, the screen going dark, reflecting my own calm, determined face. I had walked into that steakhouse as a daughter, desperately waiting for her parents to see her worth. I walked out of my apartment that morning as a woman who had finally learned to see it for herself. The era of seeking their approval was officially over. The era of my independence had begun. The execution of my plan began the very next morning. I bypassed the safe townhouse my parents expected and leveraged my insider knowledge as a real estate appraiser. I searched for distressed assets the average buyer would ignore. Within 3 weeks, I secured an FHA loan on an off-market duplex in an up-and-coming Chicago neighborhood. It was a cosmetic disaster with peeling paint and outdated plumbing, but my data confirmed the area was on the verge of massive gentrification. Instead of renting a studio as commanded, I moved into the smaller ground floor unit of the duplex. It smelled faintly of old smoke, but to me it smelled like potential. Because I occupied the property, I only put down 3.5% of my $45,000. The rest became my renovation war chest. I rented the larger upstairs unit to a hardworking couple, and their monthly rent check covered the mortgage, taxes, and insurance. My housing costs dropped to absolute zero. The physical labor was grueling. I continued working my 60-hour week at the appraisal firm, leaving the office exhausted only to drive straight to the duplex. I dedicated every evening and weekend to manual labor. I strapped on a mask and tore up stained carpeting, spending my Friday nights sanding down original hardwood floors. I watched online tutorials to learn how to hang drywall and lay tile. My hands were calloused, my back ached, and I rarely slept more than 5 hours a night. Yet, I never felt more energized. Every hammer swing was a strike for my independence. That acceleration began exactly 14 months after I purchased the duplex. The neighborhood gentrification I had banked on arrived with a vengeance. A boutique coffee shop opened 2 blocks away, followed shortly by an artisanal grocery store and a trendy fitness studio. Property values in the surrounding zip code surged upward at a dizzying rate. I ordered a professional appraisal of my fully renovated property, and the resulting valuation was everything I had projected and more. I immediately went to my commercial lender and executed a cash-out refinance. The bank handed me a substantial check for the newly created equity, giving me a massive injection of liquid capital without requiring me to sell the property. I took that cash, and within 30 days, I poured it into my next acquisition. It was a neglected fourplex situated closer to the city center, burdened by poor management and deferred maintenance. I applied the exact same aggressive, disciplined strategy I had used on the duplex. I renovated one unit at a time, upgraded the fixtures to attract premium tenants, and systematically raised the rents to match the current market rate. The momentum was intoxicating. I was no longer just saving leftover money from my paycheck. My money was now actively working for me, generating passive income 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The cash flow from the duplex and the fourplex provided a stable, growing foundation, allowing me to take significantly larger risks. Over the next 4 years, the trajectory of my life became a relentless escalation of calculated acquisitions and massive rewards. I leveraged the equity from the fourplex to acquire a mixed-use commercial and residential building in a highly desirable, high-traffic business corridor. The ground floor featured two retail storefronts that had sat vacant for over a year due to landlord neglect, while the upper floors contained 6 residential apartments in desperate need of modernization. I overhauled the commercial spaces entirely utilizing my industry connections to secure long-term leases with a highly successful restaurant group and a high-end boutique fitness studio. The residential units above were transformed into luxury lofts, instantly attracting affluent young professionals. It was a thrilling, exhausting period of my life, but every late night spent reviewing tenant applications or negotiating with commercial contractors felt like a profound victory lap. The sheer complexity of managing multiple residential leases, demanding commercial tenants, and large-scale property maintenance required a drastic shift in my operational structure. Holding these multi-million-dollar assets under my personal name was a tremendous liability risk. It also left a glaring paper trail that anyone, including my nosy parents or my entitled brother, could easily discover with a simple public records search online. I needed a strong, impenetrable corporate shield to hide behind. To achieve absolute anonymity, I hired a sharp, ruthless corporate attorney named Harrison, who specialized in asset protection and high net worth privacy for real estate investors. Sitting in his sleek downtown office, I laid out my portfolio and my strict requirements for complete confidentiality. Together, we formed a limited liability company, layering the ownership through a series of legal structures to ensure maximum privacy and legal protection. I named the company Apex Skyline Holdings. Seeing that name printed on official state incorporation documents bound in a thick leather portfolio on Harrison's desk was a profoundly emotional experience. Apex Skyline Holdings became the invisible fortress behind which I operated my growing empire. On paper, I was the sole owner and chief executive officer of a highly profitable real estate holding company. My net worth skyrocketed well into the millions. I was building a formidable, recession-resistant portfolio that commanded quiet respect in the aggressive Chicago market. But to the outside world, I was a ghost. My tenants paid their rent through a generic automated online portal. My property managers and maintenance crews reported directly to the LLC, and my family remained entirely ignorant of the massive fortune I was steadily amassing right beneath their noses. Maintaining this elaborate facade became a strange psychological game, one that I played with extreme precision and immense silent satisfaction. While my corporate bank account swelled with rental income and commercial equity, my outward appearance remained exactly the same as it had been on the night of that terrible steakhouse dinner. I continued to drive my reliable 10-year-old Honda Civic, actively choosing to ignore the rattling muffler and the fading paint on the rear bumper. I shopped at discount clothing stores wearing plain, unbranded sweaters and sensible slacks to our obligatory family gatherings. I deliberately cultivated the aura of a single woman, struggling to stay afloat in an increasingly expensive city, allowing my parents and my brother to project their arrogant preconceived assumptions onto my quiet demeanor. Whenever I attended Sunday dinners at my parents' sprawling suburban house, I politely endured their pitying looks and their thinly veiled, backhanded compliments. My father frequently asked if I was putting enough money into my tiny company retirement account, warning me in a grave tone that a single woman needed to be absolutely terrified of poverty in her old age. My mother would constantly offer to send me home with leftover casserole, loudly stating she knew groceries were getting terribly expensive for people trying to survive paycheck to paycheck. Meanwhile, Connor was putting on a masterclass in financial delusion. The $60,000 down payment our parents had gifted him had merely been the entry fee to a lifestyle he could not actually sustain on his own income. He and Brittany moved into their massive McMansion and immediately began filling the sprawling rooms with expensive custom furniture bought entirely on high-interest store credit. Connor traded his perfectly functional sedan for a brand new, fully loaded luxury SUV, constantly bragging about the prestige of the European brand, while conveniently omitting the crushing monthly lease payments from his stories. Brittany relentlessly posted perfectly curated pictures of their lavish international vacations, exclusive country club dinners, and designer wardrobes on social media. They were desperately trying to play the part of the picture-perfect wealthy couple my parents had always wanted them to be. During our family gatherings, Connor would lean against the granite kitchen counter in my parents' home, swirling a glass of expensive scotch, and offer me completely unsolicited, condescending financial advice. He loved to tell me that I was missing out on the incredible wealth-building power of homeownership, reminding me with a smug smile that paying rent was just throwing my hard-earned money down the drain. He loved to position himself as the financially savvy patriarch of his household, totally oblivious to the bitter irony that his entire existence was propped up by our parents' money and a precarious, crumbling mountain of consumer debt. I never once corrected him. I never defended my lifestyle choices, and I never offered even the slightest glimpse into the reality of my financial situation. I simply smiled politely, nodded graciously, and thanked him for his concern. The deep, internal satisfaction I felt during those moments was far more rewarding than any public validation could ever be. I did not need to brag about my commercial leases or the massive equity I held in my properties. My silence was my ultimate power. Every time they openly mocked my cheap car, I quietly thought about the lucrative commercial building I had just closed on. Every time my mother handed me leftovers out of pity, I silently calculated the positive cash flow generated by my residential units. I was playing chess while they were playing checkers, and they did not even realize we were sitting at the same board. Thanksgiving arrived 4 years after the steakhouse dinner, and my parents hosted it with a polished display of abundance they used to disguise every uncomfortable truth. By then, Connor and Brittany had two young children, a boy and a girl, whom my parents treated as proof that every sacrifice made for their golden son had been justified. The dining room table was crowded with crystal serving dishes, expensive wine, and enough food for 3 families. I arrived in my old Honda, wearing a plain wool sweater, carrying a homemade pie, and the same quiet expression my relatives had learned to interpret as failure. No one knew that I had signed closing papers on another commercial property that morning. My mother greeted me at the door with exaggerated concern. She looked me up and down, touched the sleeve of my sweater, and asked whether work had cut my hours. Before I could answer, she pressed a small envelope into my hand. At the table, after everyone had taken their seats, Patricia insisted that I open it in front of the family. Inside was a $50 grocery store gift card. She announced loudly that she knew how difficult it must be for a single woman to survive in Chicago while living paycheck to paycheck. Several relatives offered sympathetic smiles. My father nodded as though my mother had performed an act of extraordinary charity. I thanked her calmly and placed the card beside my plate. Then Patricia turned to Brittany and presented her with a cream-colored box tied in a black satin ribbon. Inside was a designer handbag that cost more than many people paid in rent. Brittany squealed, stood up, and hugged my mother while Connor recorded the moment on his phone. Patricia explained that a mother of two needed something beautiful after all the pressure of maintaining a proper home and raising the next generation. No one mentioned that Brittany employed a nanny 3 days a week, or that nearly every household expense was carried on credit cards. Connor spent dinner describing the latest improvements to his McMansion. He had replaced functioning kitchen appliances because the stainless steel finish was no longer fashionable, leased a second luxury vehicle for Brittany, and ordered imported stone for an outdoor entertainment area they rarely used. He spoke as if each new payment were evidence of wealth rather than another weight tied around his ankles. When my father praised his courage as a homeowner, Connor turned toward me with a familiar smirk. "So, Meredith," he said, "did you ever manage to buy that little townhouse, or are you still renting your tiny apartment?" I set down my fork and said I had stopped chasing townhouses entirely. His smile widened. "Renting suits you." I let him enjoy the assumption. "My job keeps me around enough properties," I replied. "Owning one small house no longer feels like the only definition of success." Connor laughed, certain I was rationalizing failure, and immediately returned to describing his leased luxury vehicles. The table laughed, accepting the explanation as a harmless example of my supposedly dull career. Connor shook his head and resumed talking about his 2 leased vehicles. I let him. The truth was that 12 different properties could have answered his question, and the newest acquisition was the strongest one yet: a neighborhood retail center with stable tenants, favorable zoning, and enough projected cash flow to cover several years of my personal expenses. Harrison and my property management team were finalizing the closing while my family discussed my grocery budget. Under the table, my phone vibrated once. I glanced down without lifting it into view. The message came from Elena, my lead property manager, closing recorded. Apex Skyline officially owns commercial property number 12. Congratulations. For a moment, the voices around me faded. I pictured the signed deed, the occupied storefronts, and the stream of rent that would arrive every month, regardless of whether my parents believed I could afford groceries. I felt no urge to correct them. Their contempt had become useful camouflage. The more convinced they were that I was barely surviving, the less likely they were to examine public records, ask informed questions, or interfere with the company I had built. My mother noticed me looking down and asked whether I was checking my bank balance before buying Christmas presents. Connor laughed and advised me to avoid carrying credit card debt. He then launched into a lecture about responsible leverage, while Brittany displayed photographs of the luxury SUV they had leased the week before. I smiled, thanked him for the advice, and transferred the grocery card into my purse. I later gave it to one of my tenants, a recently divorced mother who had been working extra shifts to cover food for her children. It was the first useful purpose my mother's public insult served. The evening ended with my parents posing Connor, Brittany, and the children in front of the fireplace for a family photograph. I was asked to take the picture. Patricia told me to make sure the McMansion visible through the tall windows appeared in the background because it represented what family commitment could accomplish. I framed the shot exactly as she requested. Through the glass, I could also see the two leased vehicles in the driveway and a contractor's truck parked near the unfinished patio. To everyone else, the image showed prosperity. To me, it showed debt layered over debt. I drove home through light snow, carrying my untouched pie dish and a sense of momentum. The 12th acquisition had pushed Apex Skyline Holdings into a different category. My commercial lender had approved a larger credit facility because the company maintained strong cash reserves, conservative debt ratios, and an unbroken record of timely payments. I had spent years protecting that record with almost obsessive care. My personal credit was equally pristine because it remained part of the foundation supporting every future deal. The next morning, while I reviewed the final closing statement for the retail center, my private phone rang. The caller was David, the commercial lending officer, who handled most of the Apex Skyline portfolio. David never called without scheduling first, unless something required immediate attention. His voice was controlled, but I heard a hesitation that had never been there during our normal conversations. He asked whether I had applied for outside personal financing, pledged my credit as a guarantor, or authorized anyone to seek a high-interest bridge loan in my name. I told him I had done none of those things. David paused and then explained that a hard inquiry had appeared on my personal credit file less than an hour earlier. The application was for $150,000 through a predatory lender that specialized in desperate borrowers. Whoever submitted it had used my full legal identity, current address, social security number, and detailed residential history. The inquiry had triggered an automatic warning because it was completely inconsistent with the disciplined financial profile he had monitored for years. I thanked him and ended the call with my voice steady. The celebration of property number 12 disappeared beneath a sharper focus. Someone had reached past my corporate walls and touched the one asset I guarded most carefully, my name. I opened my credit monitoring dashboard, saw the unfamiliar inquiry glowing against an otherwise flawless report, and began the investigation that would expose how far my family was willing to go to rescue Connor from himself. That false sense of security they projected finally began to unravel on a rainy Tuesday morning in late October. I was sitting at the massive mahogany desk in my home office, reviewing a commercial lease agreement for a new retail tenant, when my private cell phone buzzed. It was David, my dedicated commercial lending officer at the bank that handled the majority of the Apex Skyline Holdings portfolio. David and I had built a relationship based on mutual respect and absolute financial transparency. He knew my exact net worth, the precise layout of my corporate structures, and my fanatical dedication to maintaining a pristine personal credit score. So when I answered the phone and heard the uncharacteristic hesitation in his voice, my instincts immediately went on high alert. He asked if I was in the middle of securing outside financing for a personal project. I told him I was not. David let out a heavy sigh and informed me that a massive red flag had just triggered on his end. Someone had just initiated a hard inquiry on my personal credit file for a high-risk predatory bridge loan in the amount of $150,000. I felt a sudden icy chill radiate down my spine as the severe implications of his warning washed over me in real time. I did not panic, but my mind instantly shifted into crisis management mode. I thanked David profusely for the immediate warning, hung up the phone, and quickly logged into my secure credit monitoring dashboard. There it was, sitting there like a toxic stain on my otherwise flawless financial record. The inquiry had been initiated by a shadow lending firm known in the industry for charging exorbitant interest rates to desperate borrowers who could not secure traditional bank financing. Someone had actually used my full legal name, my social security number, and my previous residential history to apply for a massive personal loan. My very first thought was a standard data breach, a random identity thief who had purchased my information on the dark web. But as I began the arduous process of calling the lending firm's fraud department to halt the transaction, a much darker, much more specific suspicion began to take root deep in the back of my mind. I demanded that the lending firm lock the file and prevent any additional draws, amendments, or collection activity against me. The fraud officer then gave me the detail that resolved the timing problem. The bridge loan had already closed the previous evening, and the funds had been released into Connor and Brittany's account before the inquiry reached David's monitoring system. The chronology now made complete documented sense. What remained open was the lender's attempt to finalize my guarantor status and attach the debt to my credit profile. I requested copies of each application page, electronic signature record, uploaded identification document, and transfer confirmation securely. While the lender preserved the file, I used my professional access to examine the county records tied to Connor's property. I pulled the deed, mortgage history, tax notices, and recorded liens. The warnings formed a clear picture of a household already collapsing beneath debts it could not pay. Connor was completely underwater. The public records painted a clear, undeniable picture of a man drowning in his own manufactured prestige. He had taken out a massive second mortgage on the house just 2 years after moving in, likely to fund the luxury vehicles and the international vacations Brittany constantly flaunted on social media. There were multiple mechanics liens filed against the property by unpaid contractors who had presumably done custom work on the house. Worse still, the county had issued notices for severely delinquent property taxes spanning 2 years. The final fatal blow was sitting right there in the digital ledger for anyone to see. Connor had officially defaulted on his primary mortgage. The bank had issued a formal notice of default, starting the countdown clock to a full public foreclosure. My golden child brother, the man who loved to lecture me about the wealth-building power of real estate, was about to lose everything. He was desperate, bleeding cash, and completely out of options. An hour later, the secure email from the predatory lending firm finally arrived in my inbox. I opened the attached application documents, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted pages with clinical precision. The primary borrower listed on the application was Connor. The CO borrower was Brittany. But because their debt-to-income ratio was catastrophic and their credit scores were likely abysmal, the lender had required a guarantor with excellent credit to secure the high-risk loan. I scrolled down to the guarantor section at the bottom of the file. There, printed clearly in black ink, was my name. Below my name was my exact social security number, my date of birth, and my current residential address. But it was the handwritten signature at the very bottom of the page that made the breath catch sharply in my throat. It was a forgery, but it was not a random, sloppy imitation drawn by a stranger. I recognized the distinctive sweeping loops of the cursive lettering immediately. It was the exact same handwriting that had signed every birthday card and permission slip of my childhood. It was my mother's handwriting. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow to the chest. A random thief had not stolen my identity. My own parents had stolen it. They had deliberately committed a very serious federal crime against their own daughter simply to protect their irresponsible son from his own catastrophic choices. I sat back in my desk chair staring blankly at the glowing monitor as the entire sickening timeline snapped perfectly into place. Years ago, long before my career had taken off, I had stored a thick folder containing my original Social Security card, my birth certificate, and several old tax returns in my parents' heavy fireproof safe located in my father's study. I had left those documents there for safekeeping when I was 22, completely forgetting about them as I built my independent life and moved between various small apartments over the years. When Connor's financial house of cards finally collapsed under the weight of his own arrogance, he must have gone to our parents begging for yet another massive bailout. But this time, a simple check from their savings account was not enough to save him. The hole he had dug was far too deep, and their own liquidity was likely stretched dangerously thin from funding his previous failures and their own lifestyle. Desperate to save their precious golden child from the public humiliation of a suburban foreclosure, Richard and Patricia had deliberately crossed a line that I could never have imagined. They had opened their safe, pulled out my private financial documents, and willingly sacrificed my pristine credit to secure a desperate high-interest bridge loan. They were willing to chain me to $150,000 of toxic debt just to keep Connor's lavish facade intact for a few more months. The sheer magnitude of their betrayal was staggering, completely replacing any lingering familial affection with a cold, absolute, and unyielding resolve to make them pay for what they had done. I did not confront them. A younger, more naive version of myself might have stormed over to their sprawling suburban house, waving the forged application in their faces and demanding an explanation. I would have screamed, cried, and begged to know why I meant so little to them. But that woman no longer existed. She had been systematically dismantled over years of quiet dismissals and finally laid to rest on the night of that steakhouse dinner. In her place was a woman who understood that confronting a narcissist without absolute insurmountable leverage was a fool's errand. They would simply deny, deflect, and somehow twist the narrative to make themselves the victims, and me the ungrateful, hysterical daughter. I needed a strategy, and I needed the sharpest legal mind I knew. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line for Harrison, my corporate attorney. He answered on the second ring. I told him I needed an emergency meeting that same afternoon to discuss a massive case of identity theft and potential wire fraud. I specified that the perpetrators were my immediate family members. Harrison did not ask any probing personal questions over the phone. He simply told me to come to his office at 3 o'clock and to bring every piece of documentation I had acquired. I spent the next few hours meticulously printing out the forged loan application, the public records of Connor's defaulted mortgage, the notices of delinquent property taxes, and the mechanic's liens. I compiled everything into a thick black leather folder, the very same type of folder my father had once used to pass me that $800 dinner bill. When I arrived at Harrison's sleek downtown office, I was ushered directly into his private conference room. He sat across from me, his expression entirely neutral, as he reviewed the paperwork I slid across the polished glass table. I watched his eyes scan the forged signature, then move to the public records detailing Connor's catastrophic financial state. Harrison was a man who handled multi-million-dollar acquisitions and aggressive corporate litigation daily. Nothing surprised him, but I could tell by the slight tightening of his jaw that the sheer audacity of my parents' crime offended his professional sensibilities. He set the papers down and looked at me, his hands steepled under his chin. He confirmed that this was not a simple misunderstanding. By forging my signature as a guarantor on a $150,000 high-interest bridge loan, my parents had committed felony identity theft, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud. He warned me that untangling my name from this toxic debt would require a surgical approach. If we tipped them off too early, they could attempt to destroy the original physical documents or move assets to shield themselves from civil liability. Our strategy needed to be completely silent and absolutely ruthless. We immediately executed a hard lock on my Social Security number across all major credit bureaus, ensuring they could not initiate any further fraudulent applications. Harrison then drafted formal letters of dispute to the shadow lending firm, officially contesting the validity of the guarantor signature. He initiated a quiet forensic investigation, hiring a private investigator to track the exact flow of the stolen funds once the loan had been dispersed to Connor. The waiting game was the most difficult part of the strategy. I continued to attend the mandatory family Sunday dinners, maintaining my carefully cultivated facade of the struggling, oblivious daughter. I sat at my parents' dining room table, quietly eating my roast chicken, while Richard and Patricia beamed with misguided pride at their golden son. They actually believed they had solved his problems. They believed they had outsmarted the system, using my pristine credit as a secret lifeline to keep Connor afloat. Connor, for his part, was putting on a truly spectacular performance of absolute delusion. Despite being completely underwater and facing the imminent loss of his home, he acted like a man who had just won the lottery. I listened to him brag about the massive influx of cash he had suddenly secured, vaguely attributing it to a brilliant business maneuver he had pulled off. I did not use the stolen $150,000 to pay his delinquent property taxes, satisfy the furious contractors who had placed liens on his property, or catch up on his defaulted primary mortgage. Instead, he treated the fraudulent bridge loan like a personal slush fund to reward himself for simply existing. During a family gathering just 3 weeks after the loan was dispersed, Connor proudly announced that he and Brittany were flying to Dubai for a 2-week luxury vacation. He claimed they needed a reset to focus on their future goals. My mother clapped her hands in delight, praising him for taking care of his wife and treating her like a queen. My father nodded approvingly, stating that successful men needed to recharge their batteries. I sat there sipping my water, knowing that my stolen identity was funding their first-class plane tickets and 5-star hotel suites. But the extravagant vacation was only the beginning of his reckless spending. Harrison's private investigator uncovered the rest of the financial trail, and the details were staggering. After returning from Dubai, Connor took the remaining bulk of the stolen funds and sank them into a highly volatile, completely unregulated cryptocurrency venture recommended by one of his equally arrogant friends. He bypassed safe traditional investments, entirely chasing the illusion of overnight exponential wealth. He honestly believed he was a financial genius who could double the stolen money in a matter of months, pay back the bridge loan before the exorbitant interest rates buried him, and keep the massive profits for himself. He wanted to be the hero of his own story without actually doing any of the hard work. But the cryptocurrency market crashed violently just 6 weeks after he invested the stolen funds. His portfolio was completely wiped out. The $150,000 my parents had committed federal felonies to secure for him vanished into thin air. Connor had absolutely nothing to show for the crime committed in my name, except a few vacation photos and a worthless digital wallet. Because Connor had squandered the lifeline my parents had illegally manufactured, his original financial crisis accelerated rapidly. The primary bank holding the mortgage on his sprawling suburban McMansion ran out of patience. They had issued the initial notices of default months ago, but Connor had ignored them, assuming the problem would somehow magically resolve itself, or that our parents would simply forge another document to save him. He fundamentally lacked the capacity to understand consequence. Without the stolen funds to bring his mortgage current, the bank officially moved from default into active foreclosure proceedings. The legal notices were taped to the front door of his luxury home, completely shattering the pristine suburban image Brittany had curated for her neighbors. The property was seized by the bank, scheduled to be sold off at a public county auction to the highest bidder to recoup the massive unpaid debt. As the auction date loomed closer, the atmosphere at my parents' house shifted from arrogant celebration to barely concealed suffocating panic. Their golden child was about to be rendered homeless. This time there was absolutely no money left to steal. My quiet preparation was finally complete, and the stage was set for their ultimate collapse. The public bank auction took place on a dreary Tuesday morning inside the cavernous lobby of the county courthouse. I did not attend in person. There was no need for me to stand in a crowd of aggressive real estate speculators and risk being recognized. Instead, I sat comfortably at my desk in my home office sipping black coffee while Harrison managed the entire acquisition process through a designated proxy. The bank was highly motivated to offload the toxic asset quickly. Connor had left the property in a state of financial and legal disarray, scaring off traditional buyers who did not want to deal with clearing the mechanics liens and paying years of back taxes. But Apex Skyline Holdings had the liquid capital and the legal muscle to handle those encumbrances effortlessly. When Harrison called me just before noon to confirm that our bid had been accepted, I felt a profound sense of closure. We had purchased the sprawling suburban McMansion for literal pennies on the dollar. A few days later, a thick courier envelope arrived at my apartment. Inside rested the official deed to the property. I spread the document across my dining table, tracing my finger over the crisp black ink. The previous owner listed was the major national bank that had foreclosed on my brother. The new rightful owner recorded in the county registry was Apex Skyline Holdings. I literally owned the roof over Connor's head. I owned the chef's kitchen where Brittany hosted her lavish parties, the dedicated home office where Connor pretended to be a successful businessman, and the manicured lawn where my parents had proudly posed for pictures. The sheer poetic justice of holding that piece of paper was staggering. They had told me to simply rent a studio somewhere, dismissing my ability to own a modest townhouse. Now I possessed the very symbol of their golden child's false superiority. I knew my father would not surrender the house without a fight. Richard was a man obsessed with appearances, and the public humiliation of his son being physically evicted by the county sheriff would be unbearable for him. As I anticipated, just 48 hours after the auction concluded, my lead property manager received a frantic, highly aggressive phone call from my father. Richard was utilizing every ounce of his corporate bluster, demanding to speak directly with the chief executive officer of the new purchasing company. He wanted to use his business connections to leverage a deal, hoping to secure a favorable arrangement that would allow Connor to remain in the property. I immediately instructed my management team on exactly how to proceed. Under no circumstances was my name to be mentioned, hinted at, or included in any internal or external communications regarding this specific property. My property manager, a seasoned professional, who was well compensated for her absolute discretion, played her part flawlessly. She informed Richard that it was strict corporate policy that the executive board did not speak directly with residential occupants or their representatives. However, she indicated that the holding company might be willing to entertain a residential lease agreement provided the financial terms were highly favorable to the corporation. I sat in my living room, listening to the recorded phone calls my manager forwarded to me, fascinated by my father's desperation. Richard pushed hard for a deeply discounted rental rate, citing his own standing in the local business community as a guarantee of payment. My manager, following my explicit directives, flatly refused his lowball offers. We established a monthly rental rate that was aggressively steep, far above the standard market average for the neighborhood, and we required a massive security deposit up front. It was an extortionate figure that Connor could never afford on his own, especially with a recently foreclosed mortgage and a decimated credit score. To my absolute astonishment, Richard agreed to the terms without further negotiation. He was willing to sign any document and agree to any price, just to keep the moving trucks away from the driveway and maintain the illusion that his son was still a successful homeowner. With the trap carefully set and the lease agreement drafted, I waited for the inevitable summons. It arrived on a Thursday evening in the form of a terse, demanding text message from my mother. She instructed me to come to their house the following night for a mandatory family meeting. She added that attendance was completely non-negotiable and that we were facing a very serious family crisis. I smiled at my phone, typed a brief confirmation, and spent the rest of the evening selecting my outfit. I chose my most faded pair of jeans and a plain oversized sweater, perfectly maintaining my carefully cultivated costume of the struggling, impoverished daughter. When I arrived at my parents' house the next evening, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. The air inside the immaculate living room felt thick and heavy, charged with a desperate, frantic energy. My father stood rigidly by the fireplace, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his face set in a grim, authoritative scowl. My mother paced nervously behind the large leather sofa, wringing her hands together. Connor and Brittany were seated on the love seat, projecting an incredibly rehearsed portrait of victimhood. Brittany was dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue, while Connor sat slumped forward, his head resting in his hands, attempting to look like a man broken by circumstances entirely beyond his control. I took a seat in a single armchair near the doorway, keeping my posture defensive and small. I asked what was going on, injecting just the right amount of nervous apprehension into my voice. Connor let out a loud theatrical sigh, rubbing his temples as if he were carrying the weight of the entire world. "It is the economy," Meredith Connor muttered, shaking his head. "It is absolutely brutal out there for real investors." The market shifted without warning, and the bank decided to play hardball. We hit a temporary cash flow issue because of some bad luck with the crypto markets, and those vultures swooped in and foreclosed on the house. It is completely unfair. We built a life there, and they just ripped it away over a technicality. I listened to his delusional assessment with morbid fascination. He had squandered a massive salary blown through a stolen $150,000 loan, neglected to pay his property taxes for 2 years, and actively ignored multiple default notices from his lender. Yet in his mind, he was simply the tragic victim of a fluctuating economy and a predatory bank. There was zero accountability, zero acknowledgement of his own catastrophic financial mismanagement. Brittany leaned into his shoulder, letting out a small, dramatic sniffle. "We have just been dealing with so much bad luck," she complained, her voice whining with entitlement. "It is impossible for young families to get ahead right now. The government is not doing enough to protect homeowners, and now we are facing the prospect of losing the neighborhood we belong in. We cannot possibly subject our future children to a lesser school district just because the bank refused to be reasonable." My mother stopped pacing and stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on Connor's shoulder. "Your brother and sister-in-law have been through a terrible ordeal, Meredith," she stated, her tone shifting from comforting to accusatory as she looked at me. "They are dealing with a profound crisis, and they need their family to rally around them right now. This is a time for sacrifice and unity." My father cleared his throat, signaling that he was ready to take control of the narrative. "I have spent the last 3 days conducting some very intense high-level negotiations," he announced, puffing out his chest with self-importance. "The bank auctioned the property to a faceless corporate holding company. These corporate landlords are notoriously difficult, completely devoid of basic human decency or compassion. They only care about profit margins and squeezing every last dime out of hardworking people." I nodded slowly, keeping my expression perfectly blank. It took every ounce of willpower I possessed not to smile. "I am that faceless corporate landlord," I thought to myself. "I am the one demanding the profit margins." But thankfully, my father continued, his voice swelling with pride. "I was able to leverage my reputation to get their management team on the phone. It took some very aggressive maneuvering, but I managed to secure an agreement. They are willing to let Connor and Brittany sign a new lease and remain in the property as tenants. The moving trucks are cancelled. They do not have to leave their home." Connor looked up, offering a weak, grateful smile to our father. "You really saved us, Dad. I do not know what we would have done without you negotiating that deal." I sat back in my chair, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I knew exactly what the terms of that lease were because I had personally dictated them to my property manager. I knew the monthly rent was an astronomical figure that Connor could not possibly cover on his own, and I knew my parents did not have the liquid cash left to subsidize it indefinitely. The trap was ready, and they were stepping right into it. My father reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers. It was the residential lease agreement my attorney Harrison had drafted just 48 hours prior. Richard slapped the document onto the glass coffee table with a heavy thud. "The holding company is demanding an astronomical figure," my father stated, his tone grave. "They want exactly $8,500 a month in rent. Furthermore, they are now requiring the first month, the last month, and a security deposit equal to 2 months of rent paid upfront via wire transfer. It comes to $34,000 due by the end of the week before they will hand over the new keys." Connor let out a sharp, panicked breath. He slumped back against the sofa cushions, his face draining of color. Dad, I cannot afford that. I am completely tapped out. The lawyer fees for the foreclosure took everything I had left. I certainly cannot swing exactly 8 grand a month on my current corporate salary. Brittany began to cry in earnest right now, burying her face in her manicured hands, sobbing loudly. We are going to be completely homeless, she wailed in absolute misery. We are going to have to move into a tiny apartment, and the kids at the country club will laugh at us constantly. I cannot live like that, Connor. I absolutely refuse to live like a peasant. My father held up a hand to silence her dramatic theatrics immediately. Nobody is moving into an apartment, Brittany, he said firmly. He turned his gaze toward my mother. Patricia gave him a single definitive nod. The unspoken communication between them was truly chilling. They had clearly rehearsed this exact scenario before I arrived at the house tonight, perfectly coordinating their upcoming attack on my personal finances. My mother took a step forward, closing the physical distance between us. She looked down at me, her eyes completely devoid of any maternal warmth. This is where you come in. Meredith, she said, her voice dropping into a register that was both commanding and entirely presumptuous. Your brother is in a desperate situation, and as a family, we must pool our resources to ensure his financial stability immediately. I looked up. I looked right at her, keeping my face perfectly blank. What exactly does pooling our resources mean, Mom? It means you need to be practical, she replied, crossing her arms over her chest defensively. You are 33 years old and you are still living alone in a tiny rental apartment. You have no husband, no children, and absolutely no need for your own private apartment. It is a completely frivolous waste of money. We have decided that the most logical solution is for you to break your current lease immediately. I stared at her, genuinely marveling at her sheer audacity. You want me to break my lease and live where? Here, of course, my father interjected loudly, stepping right up beside my mother now. He presented a united, impenetrable front against my expected resistance to their terrible plan. Your old childhood bedroom is currently being used for extra storage, but we can clear out a space for a twin bed. You will move back in with us immediately. By eliminating your monthly rent and your utility bills, you will have a significant amount of disposable income. And what am I supposed to do with that disposable income? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I wanted them to say it all out loud. I wanted to hear them articulate the full extent of their financial parasitism clearly. Patricia let out an exasperated sigh, treating me like a slow, stubborn child who was failing to grasp basic, simple logic. You are going to give your salary to your brother Meredith. It is simple math. Without your heavy rent hanging over your head, your income covers the $8,500 Connor needs for his monthly lease. It is the perfect solution. But what about the $34,000 deposit? Connor asked eagerly, suddenly sitting up straighter. The panic in his eyes was rapidly being replaced by a greedy, desperate hope. He looked at me like a starving man looking at a meal. That is also taken care of, my father stated firmly, pointing a rigid finger at me. You still have your $45,000 sitting in your savings account untouched. You bragged about it loudly enough at the steakhouse dinner. You are going to wire $34,000 to the corporate landlord tomorrow morning, immediately, to secure the lease. The remaining $11,000 can be used to help Connor and Brittany cover their living expenses while they get right back on their feet. I sat frozen in my small armchair. I had spent years anticipating their entitlement, but the sheer breathtaking magnitude of this demand exceeded even my darkest, most cynical expectations regarding their boundless favoritism toward my brother. They were demanding that I surrender my entire life savings, forfeit my independence, and move back into a storage closet. I would become an indentured servant whose sole purpose was to fund my brother's lavish luxury lifestyle. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, I said, keeping my tone carefully measured to mask the furious, triumphant adrenaline rushing through my veins. You want me to empty the savings account that I spent years building. You want me to give up my tiny apartment and surrender my entire paycheck to Connor so he can continue living in a mansion he already lost completely. And in return, I get to sleep in a storage room. Do not use that tone with me, my mother snapped. Her face flushed with sudden hot anger. You are acting as if we are asking you to cut off an arm. We are asking you to help your own flesh and blood. Connor has a wife. He has a future family to consider carefully right now. You have nothing but your career. Your money is just sitting there doing absolutely nothing while your brother is facing utter ruin and public humiliation. Brittany sniffled and looked at me with red, watery, desperate eyes. Meredith, please, please, she begged, her voice trembling with manipulative fragility. If you do not do this for us, we will lose everything. How can you be so selfish? How can you sit there and watch us suffer when you have the power to fix it? If you really loved your brother, you would not even hesitate now. The emotional manipulation was completely suffocating. My father stepped much closer, his physical presence designed perfectly to intimidate me into complete, unquestioning submission. It is time you actually contributed to this family, he demanded, his voice echoing loudly in the room. We have never asked you for anything, Meredith. We let you pursue your little appraisal career and live your independent life. But this is a crisis. You are going to step up and fulfill your obligations to this family, or you will no longer be a part of it. He paused, letting the heavy threat of permanent exclusion hang in the quiet, cold air. You will transfer the $34,000 first thing tomorrow in the morning. This discussion is now over. He turned his back on me and walked over to the mahogany side table to pour himself a tall glass of expensive bourbon, acting as if the entire matter was completely settled forever. I remained in the armchair and looked from my father to my mother, allowing them to mistake my silence for fear. Connor watched with open hunger, already calculating how quickly he could spend the money they believed was untouched in my savings account. They expected surrender. Instead, I asked one quiet question. Before I transfer anything, I said, I need an explanation for the $150,000 bridge loan that appeared on my credit report. The room changed instantly. Patricia's expression froze. Richard's bourbon glass stopped halfway to his mouth. Connor looked toward our father before he could control the movement. It was brief, but it told me everything Harrison's forensic report had already proven. They knew exactly what I was talking about. My father recovered first. He placed the glass on the side table and frowned as though I had interrupted him with something trivial. I have no idea what you mean, he said. You probably clicked on one of those online lending advertisements. People your age are careless with technology, and now you are trying to turn your mistake into another family drama. I never applied for that loan, I replied. My name was listed as guarantor for Connor and Brittany. The application contained my social security number, old tax information, and a forged signature. Connor stood abruptly. That is insane, he snapped. You are obsessed with blaming me for everything. I have my own financial contacts. I would never need your insignificant credit history. His denial was almost impressive. Patricia moved closer, lowering her voice into the falsely soothing tone she used whenever she wanted to rewrite reality. Meredith, she said, you have always imagined conspiracies involving your brother. Perhaps the lender confused your information because you share an old family address. There is no crime and no reason to humiliate Connor when he is already suffering. The address on the application is my current apartment, I said. The supporting documents came from the folder I left in Dad's safe. Her eyes flickered. Then she hardened. Even if some information was used, she said, families share resources. We raised you, paid for your childhood, and gave you every opportunity to build that little career. You do not get to accuse us of stealing simply because paperwork was completed to protect your brother's home. There it was. Not a confession in the legal sense, but the moral confession I wanted to hear. In her mind, my identity belonged to them because they had raised me. My future was an account they could withdraw from whenever Connor required another bailout. Richard stepped between us and pointed toward the lease documents on the coffee table. This conversation is over, he said. You will sign the payment agreement, transfer the $34,000, and set up an automatic monthly payment from your salary. If you refuse, you are no longer our daughter. You will be removed from every family event, every holiday, and every future inheritance. We will tell the entire family that you abandoned your brother and his children when they needed you most. I lowered my eyes as though the threat had landed. Inside, I was thinking about the recorded deed, the preserved lending records, the handwriting comparison, and the police report Harrison had prepared. Their demand had also produced a written contract proving they intended to force me to finance the same fraud they denied committing. I looked at the agreement and allowed my shoulders to soften. Fine, I said. I will sign it. Connor exhaled in relief. Brittany pressed both hands together and whispered, "Thank God." My mother's mouth curved into a victorious smile, but my father remained suspicious. "You will sign tonight," he said. "No." I picked up the contract but left the pen on the table. If I am surrendering my savings and my salary for the family, then I want the family to witness it. You have spent years telling everyone that Connor represents loyalty and that I am selfish. Let us make the arrangement public so no one can later claim I refuse to help. Patricia narrowed her eyes. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Your 40th anniversary gala is in 2 weeks," I said. "The entire extended family will be there along with Dad's business associates and the people whose opinions matter so much to both of you. Present the contract there. Explain what you are asking me to do, and I will sign it in front of everyone." For several seconds, no one spoke. I watched greed defeat caution. Richard imagined a public display in which the difficult daughter submitted to his authority. Patricia imagined relatives praising her. Connor imagined money reaching the corporate landlord, never realizing it would flow into a company I owned. My father slowly smiled. "That is the first sensible thing you have said all evening. We will make the signing part of the celebration. Once everyone sees you accept your responsibilities, perhaps they will finally understand that we raised two loyal children." Before leaving, I turned at the doorway. "I want the exact version you expect me to sign," I said. "No changes after tonight. Send me a digital copy tomorrow." Richard agreed, pleased by what he interpreted as nervous preparation. The next morning, the contract arrived from his personal email account. It required me to provide the full deposit, surrender monthly income, and accept responsibility for Connor's rent, without receiving any ownership interest or repayment rights. Harrison nearly laughed when he read it. The document transformed their verbal extortion into dated, traceable evidence. Over the next 14 days, Harrison and I prepared with precision. He finalized the forensic report tracing the bridge loan into Connor's accounts, the Dubai expenses, and the failed cryptocurrency investment. A handwriting specialist linked the forged signature to Patricia. We filed the identity theft report, disputed the loan, preserved every communication, and prepared the civil complaint for lawful service at the gala. Harrison also arranged for a licensed process server to attend discreetly, ensuring the lawsuit would be delivered only after I completed the public reveal there. At the same time, I completed every remaining payment and county filing required to secure Apex Skyline Holdings' ownership of Connor's former home. My property manager kept all communication under the company name. The lease Richard had negotiated remained unsigned, exactly as I intended. Without a completed tenancy agreement, Connor had no contractual right to remain once the temporary possession period ended. I selected the documents for the reveal and arranged them inside a thick black legal folder: the recorded deed, Apex Skylines Incorporation papers, the forensic report, the police report, the fraudulent loan application, and the contract my father planned to force me to sign. Each document answered a different lie. Together, they formed the account of what my family had done and why their plan could no longer survive exposure. On the afternoon of the gala, Patricia sent a message reminding me to wear something presentable and not ruin their important evening. Richard added that the signing would occur after his anniversary speech. I replied with 2 words I understand. They read obedience in that message. What I meant was that I understood the trap, the evidence, and the exact moment their protected reputation would collapse. When I closed the black folder and heard its metal clasp click into place, the sound felt final. They had demanded a public signature. They were about to receive a public accounting instead. The 40th anniversary gala took place on a crisp, unusually cold Saturday evening at the most exclusive private country club in the entire metropolitan area. My parents had spent a small fortune on the extravagant event, likely draining whatever remained of their liquid retirement assets to ensure the evening projected a flawless image of untouchable prosperity. The venue was a sprawling historic stone estate surrounded by immaculate, rolling golf courses and perfectly manicured botanical gardens. When I pulled my reliable 10-year-old Honda Civic into the grand sweeping circular driveway. The uniformed valet actually hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping forward to open my door. The sprawling parking lot was an absolute sea of luxury imported vehicles, gleaming sports cars and chauffeured black town cars, reflecting the incredibly elite, powerful status of the guest list my parents had carefully curated. I stepped out of my vehicle wearing a simple, unbranded black dress that I had purchased several years ago for a corporate event. I carried the heavy black legal folder tucked discreetly under my arm, blending seamlessly into the shadows, as I made my way up the wide stone steps and walked directly through the towering mahogany doors into the main ballroom. The space was breathtakingly lavish, dripping with excessive opulent wealth. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from high vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden light over dozens of round tables draped in heavy expensive silk linens. Towering floral centerpieces composed of rare white orchids dominated the room, and a live string quartet played soft classical music in the softly lit corner. The ballroom was packed to absolute capacity, with over 200 well-dressed guests. My father had invited all of his most important business associates, wealthy local real estate investors, and prominent municipal politicians he wished to impress. The entire extended family was also in attendance, dressed in their absolute finest formal wear, casually sipping top-shelf champagne from delicate crystal flutes. I stood quietly near the back of the room, observing the extravagant spectacle with cold, analytical detachment. My mother was holding court near a massive gleaming ice sculpture carved into the shape of two intertwining swans. She was wearing a sparkling custom designer gown and dripping in expensive diamond jewelry. She laughed loudly at a joke made by a prominent bank executive aggressively projecting the image of a carefree, affluent matriarch without a single financial worry. Connor and Brittany were working the room with desperate, almost frantic energy. They were aggressively networking, clinging desperately to their fabricated status as wealthy suburban homeowners. I watched Connor firmly shake hands with a commercial real estate developer, casually mentioning his massive property portfolio and his deep supposed understanding of shifting market trends. I was completely ignoring the harsh reality that he had officially lost his sprawling home to a public bank auction just a few short weeks prior. His capacity for absolute self-deception was truly spectacular to witness in person. I remained in the background nursing a simple glass of sparkling water with lime, politely avoiding any prolonged small talk with my curious aunts and uncles. I was simply waiting patiently for the main event to begin. Exactly an hour into the evening, the string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The large room quieted down to a respectful hush as the catering director chimed a small silver bell. My father confidently strode up to a small elevated stage located at the front of the ballroom, taking the microphone from a chrome stand. My mother quickly joined him, smiling radiantly, as the affluent crowd erupted into polite, sustained applause. Richard held up his hands, soaking in the admiration for a long moment before beginning his carefully rehearsed speech. He spoke eloquently about 40 years of marriage, emphasizing the absolute importance of fierce family loyalty, shared traditional values, and the necessity of leaving a powerful, lasting legacy for the next generation. He spoke about sacrifice and duty, using broad, sweeping statements that resonated perfectly with the older, wealthy guests sitting at the front tables. He then turned his attention to his children, deliberately focusing the entire spotlight on my older brother. He praised Connor extensively, calling him a brilliant natural leader, a fiercely devoted family man, and the bright shining future of their distinguished family name. He spoke at length about Connor's beautiful suburban home and his allegedly impressive corporate career, weaving a complete, utter fairy tale of success that the entire room swallowed without a single moment of hesitation. Connor stood near the front of the stage, puffing out his chest and smiling humbly as the crowd applauded him warmly. Brittany clapped enthusiastically, soaking up the vicarious prestige and the admiring glances of the other wives in attendance. Then my father's gaze swept slowly across the crowded room and finally landed directly on me, standing quietly in the back shadows, clutching my black folder. With a condescending, patronizing chuckle, he deliberately shifted his tone to deliver a deeply passive-aggressive insult, entirely disguised as affectionate family teasing. He pointed me out to the crowd, asking everyone to give a small round of applause for his incredibly practical, fiercely frugal daughter. He loudly declared that while Connor was aggressively building a massive financial empire, they were equally proud of my incredibly simple, beautifully quiet life. He joked that it took a very special kind of person to be completely satisfied with a tiny rental apartment and a rusty 10-year-old car in a city full of ambition. He suggested my profound lack of drive was actually a charming, quaint personality quirk that kept me wonderfully grounded while the rest of the family soared to much greater heights. He painted me as a sweet, simple-minded spinster who simply lacked the intelligence or the necessary grit to achieve anything remotely significant in the real world. The wealthy guests laughed politely at his cruel joke, turning in their seats to look at me with thinly veiled pity and blatant condescension. My aunts and uncles offered me sympathetic, patronizing smiles, whispering among themselves about my supposedly unfortunate, lonely situation. My mother beamed widely from the brightly lit stage, perfectly satisfied with my very public humiliation. Connor openly smirked, obviously enjoying the fact that my father was tearing me down to build him up in front of the city's elite. I did not flinch at all. I did not look away in shame, and I did not let a single emotion show on my face. I simply stood my ground, took a very slow, deep breath, and gripped the heavy black legal folder a little tighter under my arm. I stared directly back at my father, knowing with absolute, terrifying certainty that their entire fabricated world was about to come crashing down in spectacular fashion. I was fully prepared to quickly expose the undeniable, ugly truth in front of every single wealthy person they were trying so desperately to impress here tonight. As the polite applause echoed through the grand ballroom, my father handed the microphone back to the catering director. He offered one final triumphant wave to his wealthy audience before stepping down from the elevated stage. My mother followed closely behind him, her diamond necklace catching the light, while Connor strutted beside them with his chest still puffed out in manufactured pride. They did not linger near the front to accept the immediate congratulations of their peers. Instead, they moved with deliberate predatory purpose. They wove through the crowded tables of high society guests, making a direct, unwavering beeline straight for the shadowy corner where I stood. They were coming to collect. They believed that by cornering me in the middle of a massive public social event, they could weaponize my natural desire to avoid public embarrassment. They assumed I would simply sign my financial life away rather than cause a scene in front of their affluent friends. I watched them approach, my heart beating with a slow, steady rhythm. I did not retreat. I stepped forward, moving out of the shadows and stepping directly into the warm light of a nearby crystal chandelier. I approached a small, empty cocktail table covered in a crisp, white linen cloth and stood behind it, establishing my physical boundary. Richard reached the table first, his smile instantly vanishing the second he was out of earshot of his business associates. He looked at me with cold, hard expectation. My father did not offer a greeting. He did not ask how I was enjoying the lavish anniversary celebration. He simply unbuttoned his tailored suit jacket, reached into the inner breast pocket, and pulled out a neatly folded legal document. He smoothed the paper out with his large hands and placed it flat onto the center of the white tablecloth. It was the rent payment contract they had presented to me 2 weeks prior. He reached into his other pocket, withdrew an expensive silver fountain pen, and placed it deliberately right on top of the signature line. "Sign it." "Meredith," my father ordered, his voice kept low, but vibrating with absolute authority. "We have given you more than enough time to accept your responsibilities." Connor stepped up right beside our father, flanking him like a loyal soldier. He leaned his knuckles on the table, leaning into my personal space, and offered me a condescending, arrogant smirk. "Time to pay up, sis," Connor whispered, his breath smelling faintly of expensive bourbon. "You heard Dad during the speech. You are the simple, practical one. You do not need all that savings. Just sign the paper, set up the monthly wire transfer, and do not embarrass Mom and Dad tonight." Brittany stood just behind him, crossing her arms and tapping her designer heel impatiently against the polished hardwood floor. We need that $34,000 deposit cleared by Monday morning, Brittany chimed in, her voice dripping with entitlement. We have suffered enough anxiety over this housing situation. I looked down at the silver fountain pen resting on the contract. I did not reach for it. I did not flinch, and I did not break eye contact with my brother. Instead, I slowly lifted my right arm and placed the thick black legal folder I had been carrying directly onto the table, right next to their absurd contract. The heavy thud of the folder hitting the wood beneath the linen caused my mother to blink in surprise. "What are you doing, Meredith?" Patricia hissed, glancing nervously at a nearby table of bank executives to ensure they were not watching us. "Stop playing games and sign the document immediately." I unclasped the metal closure of the black folder. I reached inside and pulled out the first document. It was printed on thick official county registry paper, bearing the raised embossed seal of the local municipal government. I placed it gently over their rent contract, completely covering the signature line. "Take a good look at that, Connor," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the soft classical music playing in the background. My tone was entirely calm, completely devoid of the hysteria they expected. "That is the official recorded deed to your sprawling suburban mansion. The one the bank foreclosed on. The one that was auctioned off to a corporate buyer for pennies on the dollar because you failed to pay your property taxes for 2 years." Connor frowned, looking down at the paper. His eyes scanned the document, searching for the name of the new owner. "It says Apex Skyline Holdings," he muttered, genuine confusion bleeding into his voice. I reached into my black folder a second time. I pulled out a stack of corporate incorporation documents stamped and certified by the Secretary of State and dropped them directly on top of the deed. The sharp smack of heavy paper against the table turned the heads of guests at the adjacent tables. The polite chatter around us began to die, replaced by a curious silence as people noticed the mounting tension. "Look closely at the executive officer listed on those papers," I instructed, leaning forward with both hands flat on the table. "Look at the name of the sole owner and chief executive officer of Apex Skyline Holdings." Connor bent over the documents, his eyes darting across the legal text. I watched the exact second realization struck him. His arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by sheer horror. The blood drained from his cheeks. My father snatched the papers from the table and stared at my name beneath the corporate seal. Connor looked up at me, his voice thin. "Are you saying that house is yours?" I held his stare steadily. "Which one?" I asked. His mouth fell open. I let the question settle before tapping the deed. "This house is mine," I continued. "The duplex, the fourplex, the mixed-use building, and the rest of the Apex portfolio are mine as well." Then I raised my voice so the nearby guests could hear every word. "Why would I pay you rent, Connor, when I am the landlord? Why would I subsidize your lifestyle when I own the roof over your head?" My parents and my brother stood paralyzed with shock. They were completely frozen, rendered entirely speechless as the surrounding high society guests stopped their conversations and openly turned to listen. But I was not finished. I reached into the black folder one final time. I pulled out a stapled packet containing the forensic financial report and the official stamped police report. I held them up for my father to see. "You are not just a terrible father, Richard. You are a federal criminal," I announced, projecting my voice so it echoed across the silent ballroom. I loudly and clearly explained to the captivated audience how Richard, Patricia, and Connor had conspired to commit felony identity theft and wire fraud. I explained how they stole my social security number from their home safe to forge my signature as a guarantor on a predatory $150,000 loan. Gasps of horror rippled through the crowd of elite business associates and extended family members. The pristine, untouchable facade my parents had spent 40 years meticulously building shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of their very eyes. The profound silence in the ballroom lasted only for a few agonizing seconds before the sheer weight of the exposure finally broke my mother's paralyzing shock. Patricia let out a loud, piercing gasp that echoed sharply across the room. Her hands flew to her diamond necklace as if she were trying to protect herself from a physical blow. She lunged forward, slamming both of her shaking hands onto the table, desperately trying to sweep the forensic financial reports out of sight. You are a liar. Patricia shrieked, her voice cracking with a frantic, unhinged hysteria that completely abandoned her cultivated high society persona. She turned wildly toward the surrounding tables of bank executives and local politicians, her face a mask of panicked desperation. Do not listen to a single word she is saying. My daughter is mentally unstable. She has always been fiercely jealous of her brother. She fabricated all of these ridiculous documents just to ruin our special night because she is a bitter, lonely woman. My father quickly joined her frantic defense, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson. He grabbed my upper arm, his grip painfully tight as he tried to physically pull me away from the spotlight. Meredith, you will shut your mouth right now and get out of this building before I have security throw you out. Richard demanded, his voice a low, vicious growl meant only for my ears. But I did not shrink away, and I did not let him move me. I stood my ground, staring coldly into his furious eyes, completely unbothered by his physical intimidation. I told you, Dad, I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level and loud enough for the guests to hear. I am not the one who needs to worry about security or the authorities tonight. As my father opened his mouth to shout another desperate threat, a tall, impeccably dressed figure smoothly separated himself from a cluster of wealthy guests standing near the ice sculpture. It was Harrison. He walked forward with calm, measured authority of a man who commanded corporate boardrooms and ruthless litigation for a living. He did not rush, and he did not look even slightly intimidated by the overwhelming opulence of the country club. He carried a sleek leather briefcase, his expression a portrait of absolute chilling professionalism. Please remove your hand from my client, Harrison, stated his voice, cutting through my mother's hysterical rambling with sharp, undeniable authority. My father blinked in confusion, his grip loosening just enough for me to pull my arm away and step back to stand beside my attorney. Who the hell are you? Richard demanded, attempting to regain his dominant posture while glancing nervously at the watching crowd. I am Harrison, lead corporate counsel for Apex Skyline Holdings and personal legal representation for your daughter, he replied smoothly, adjusting his tailored suit jacket. And I am here to ensure that this formal legal notification is executed properly and publicly, just as my client requested. Harrison unlatched his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents printed on heavy legal paper. He turned to my parents, who were now watching him with a growing sense of absolute dread. Richard and Patricia, you are hereby officially served with a civil lawsuit for felony identity theft, wire fraud, and the unauthorized dissipation of my client's credit for your own financial gain. Harrison placed the lawsuit directly onto my mother's chest. She reflexively caught the heavy packet before it fell, her hands shaking violently as she stared down at the bold legal print. We have already provided all forensic evidence of your forged signatures to the district attorney's office for a full criminal review. Harrison continued, his voice carrying clearly to the captivated audience. But this civil suit ensures that every single dollar you stole, along with all associated legal fees and punitive damages, will be aggressively extracted from your remaining personal assets. My mother let out a small, strangled whimper, finally realizing that she could not gaslight her way out of a documented federal crime. Harrison then turned his sharp, calculating gaze toward my brother. Connor remained beside the table, completely frozen, like a man staring into the headlights of an approaching train. All of his smug confidence had evaporated, leaving only a terrified, financially ruined man facing the consequences of his own actions. Harrison removed a second, thinner document from his briefcase and held it out until Connor accepted it with trembling fingers. Connor, my client formally declines your proposed residential lease for the property you lost at auction, Harrison announced. You are therefore receiving a 3-day notice demanding possession of the premises. You and every occupant have 72 hours to leave voluntarily. If you remain after that deadline, Apex Skyline Holdings will immediately file the required eviction action, seek a court order for possession, and request lawful enforcement by the county sheriff once that order is entered. The notice does not allow you to create a tenancy, and it does not erase the foreclosure that terminated your ownership. Harrison's explanation was precise enough that even the watching bankers understood the process. Brittany released a piercing wail that shattered the ballroom's silence. She lunged forward, seized Connor's arm, and shook him violently. "Tell me this is a joke," she screamed, abandoning every remaining trace of country club decorum. "Tell me we are not losing the house. Tell me you did not steal from your sister and gamble away the money." Connor could not look at her. He stared at the notice, his mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. For the first time, there was no parent-lender forged signature or public performance capable of rescuing him. He was utterly defeated by the sister he had mocked throughout his life. The absolute finality of Harrison's legal delivery acted as the catalyst for the ultimate social collapse of my parents' carefully constructed world. The wealthy business associates, the prominent politicians, and the elite country club friends, who had spent the entire evening drinking my parents' expensive champagne, now looked at them with unvarnished visceral disgust. In the high society circles my parents so desperately wanted to belong to, financial ruin was considered an unfortunate tragedy, but stealing the identity of your own daughter to commit a felony was an unforgivable, socially fatal crime. I watched as a prominent real estate investor, a man my father had been courting for a massive joint venture, simply set his crystal glass down on a nearby table, turned his back on my father, and walked directly out of the ballroom. It was like watching a dam break. One by one, the wealthy guests began to murmur quietly among themselves, shaking their heads in absolute revulsion before moving toward the heavy mahogany doors. Even my extended family members, the aunts and uncles who had laughed at my father's cruel jokes just moments before, now refused to make eye contact with my parents. They gathered their coats and hurried toward the exits, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of my parents' public disgrace. I did not stay to watch them cry. I picked up my modest leather purse, nodded my head to Harrison, and turned my back on my family forever. I walked out of the ballroom with my head held high, leaving them standing entirely alone in the center of their ruined, empty celebration. The 72 hours following the anniversary gala passed with the relentless, unforgiving precision of a ticking clock. Connor and Brittany initially treated Harrison's eviction notice as another one of my supposed dramatic bluffs. They spent the entire weekend desperately calling their dwindling list of social contacts, trying to find a high-powered lawyer who could somehow invalidate my legal ownership of their home. But every attorney they consulted took one look at the flawless corporate documentation from Apex Skyline Holdings and the undeniable proof of their own defaulted mortgage before politely declining to take the case. By Monday afternoon, the harsh reality finally began to shatter their carefully maintained delusions. Moving trucks arrived at the property, hired frantically at exorbitant last-minute rates. I received detailed updates from my property manager, who sat parked across the street to oversee the transition. She described watching Brittany storm out of the house with a pair of oversized sunglasses hiding her tear-streaked face, aggressively directing movers to pack only her own designer clothing and the children's belongings into a separate vehicle. The moment Brittany realized the stolen $150,000 was completely gone and that Connor was actively facing severe federal criminal charges, her fierce loyalty evaporated instantly. She had married a man she believed was a wealthy, successful patriarch, not an unemployed felon who had just been evicted by his own younger sister. She packed the kids into her leased luxury SUV, drove directly to her parents' house in a neighboring state, and officially filed for divorce before the end of the week. She left Connor standing alone in the massive empty foyer of the house he no longer owned, watching his fabricated life dissolve into nothing. Stripped of his family, his marriage, and his fabricated wealth, Connor had absolutely no choice but to face the exact financial reality he had spent years avoiding. With a decimated credit score and zero liquid savings, he could not secure a lease in any of the affluent suburban neighborhoods he considered acceptable. He was forced to move into a tiny rundown studio apartment located in a heavily industrialized part of the city. The building had peeling paint, a rattling radiator, and a single window that offered a depressing view of a brick alleyway filled with dumpsters. It was the exact type of cramped, modest space he had viciously mocked me for living in just a few short years ago when he told me real estate was a man's game. I found a deep, quiet satisfaction in the absolute symmetry of his new bleak circumstances. I was finally learning the true exhausting cost of paying rent while having absolutely nothing of value to call his own. While Connor adjusted to his grim new reality, my parents were fighting a terrifying battle for their own survival. The federal prosecutors reviewing the file did not view their actions as a misguided attempt to help a struggling son. They saw a calculated conspiracy involving identity theft, forged financial documents, and interstate electronic transfers made against their own daughter. Harrison's forensic evidence left Richard and Patricia with no room to challenge the transaction history or the handwriting analysis. They were facing the possibility of federal charges and significant prison time if they rejected a negotiated resolution. My father, a man who had built his identity around projecting power and control, was reduced to a terrified shell of his former self. His defense attorneys warned that taking the case to trial would expose both him and Patricia to convictions supported by the lender's records, the forensic accounting, and the handwriting evidence. To avoid spending their remaining years in prison, they accepted a severe federal plea agreement. The court required full restitution to me, substantial fines and penalties, and continuing financial disclosures during supervision. They were legally bound to repay every dollar connected to the fraudulent loan, reimburse the costs caused by the identity theft, and satisfy the civil judgment Harrison pursued against their remaining assets. Because they had already squandered the majority of their liquid cash, funding their lavish lifestyle and paying for the extravagant anniversary gala, my parents did not have the funds readily available to satisfy the aggressive court order. They were legally compelled to completely liquidate their carefully guarded retirement accounts, paying exorbitant early withdrawal penalties just to access the cash quickly. But even that extreme measure was not nearly enough to cover the massive debt they had incurred through their crimes and their rapidly mounting legal defense fees. The final crushing blow came when they were forced to put their sprawling 5-bedroom suburban home on the highly competitive real estate market. They had to list the property for a quick, desperate sale, accepting a cash offer well below market value, just to satisfy the looming court deadlines before the judge revoked their plea deal. The beautiful house that had served as the ultimate symbol of their generational wealth, the very place where they had hosted countless Sunday dinners and aggressively favored my brother, was suddenly gone forever. They painstakingly packed up 30 years of memories into cardboard boxes, sold off their expensive antique furniture to pay their lawyers, and moved into a modest, nondescript apartment complex on the far outskirts of the city. The harsh physical downgrade in their living situation was a constant daily reminder of their spectacular fall from grace. They had sacrificed their entire financial future, their unblemished social standing, and their comfortable retirement to save a son who ultimately lost everything anyway. They had traded their prestigious country club memberships for the suffocating reality of a strict monthly budget and court-mandated check-ins. Their friends had abandoned them, their golden child was living in a slum, and their daughter had become entirely untouchable. In their desperate, arrogant attempt to force me to pay for my brother's failures, they had unknowingly orchestrated their own absolute, irreversible financial ruin. They were finally paying the absolute ultimate price. 6 months passed since the gavel fell and sealed their fate. The chaotic storm of legal proceedings, desperate phone calls, and public humiliation eventually faded into a profound, uninterrupted silence. In the immediate aftermath of their financial liquidation, my parents and my brother tried every conceivable method to bypass the strict communication boundaries I had established. My phone automatically filtered dozens of blocked voicemails filled with alternating demands for forgiveness and bitter accusations. When digital communication failed, they attempted to send handwritten letters through intermediaries, begging for a second chance to rebuild the family. I did not open a single envelope. I instructed Harrison to return every piece of mail unread, alongside a formal cease and desist warning. The toxic chapter of my life involving Richard, Patricia, and Connor was permanently closed, locked away behind an impenetrable wall of legal consequences and my own unwavering self-respect. I had finally excised the poison from my life, and the resulting peace was absolutely intoxicating. I stepped out onto the expansive glass balcony of my newly acquired ultra-luxury penthouse, letting the cool evening breeze wash over me. The panoramic view of the glittering Chicago skyline stretched out in every direction, a breathtaking sea of towering skyscrapers and shimmering city lights. I had purchased this magnificent residence entirely in cash just 3 weeks ago, officially retiring my costume of the struggling, impoverished appraiser. I no longer needed to hide my success or shrink myself to accommodate the fragile egos of my biological relatives. I stood at the edge of the sleek glass railing, resting my hands on the cool metal, and looked down at the vibrant, bustling city far below. It was a city I now owned a significant piece of. The portfolio of Apex Skyline Holdings had expanded exponentially over the past half year, acquiring several new commercial properties and luxury residential high-rises. My invisible empire was no longer invisible. It was a dominant, undeniable force in the real estate market, and I was the undisputed architect of its massive success. The sound of warm, genuine laughter drifted through the open floor-to-ceiling sliding glass doors behind me. I turned to look back inside the sprawling, immaculately designed living area of my penthouse. The space was filled with the people who actually mattered, the individuals who had supported my vision, protected my interests, and proven their loyalty through unwavering action. Harrison stood near the massive marble kitchen island, his usually stern corporate demeanor relaxed into an easy, comfortable smile as he chatted with my lead property manager. My entire management team, the dedicated professionals who had flawlessly executed my most aggressive acquisition strategies and maintained absolute discretion during my stealthy rise to power, were gathered around the custom dining table, enjoying catered appetizers. A small, carefully curated circle of true friends mingled throughout the room, creating an atmosphere of authentic joy and shared triumph. There was no performative bragging, no passive-aggressive posturing, and absolutely no conditional love. This was my chosen family, an inner circle built on mutual respect and genuine admiration rather than forced biological obligation. A uniformed waiter approached me on the balcony offering a silver tray. I smiled and picked up a delicate crystal flute filled with premium vintage champagne. The bubbles danced and sparkled in the ambient light of the city. I held the cold glass in my hand, feeling the solid, undeniable weight of my own monumental achievements. I walked back toward the edge of the balcony, taking a slow, deliberate sip of the expensive wine. I let my eyes wander over the sprawling urban landscape, tracing the illuminated streets and the towering silhouettes of the commercial districts. Somewhere out there in the dark, sprawling expanse of the distant suburbs, Connor was sitting in his cramped, decaying apartment. Somewhere else, my parents were navigating the suffocating reality of their new, severely restricted existence, their massive house and their pristine reputation completely gone. They had demanded that I surrender my entire future to fund their delusions of grandeur. They had threatened to cast me out if I did not comply with their parasitic demands. I smiled, a deep, resonant feeling of absolute satisfaction blooming warmly in my chest. I thought back to that fateful night at the steakhouse, remembering the exact tone of my mother's voice when she haughtily dismissed my carefully planned savings goal. I remembered the condescending wave of her manicured hand and the sheer arrogance in my father's eyes when they handed my brother that $60,000 check. They had looked down at me, a woman they considered entirely insignificant, and told me that real estate was reserved for people with real families. They had ordered me to abandon my ambitions, to stop dreaming of a modest townhouse, and to simply go rent a studio somewhere in the city. I raised my crystal glass toward the glowing Chicago skyline, offering a silent, triumphant toast to the night that had fundamentally changed the entire trajectory of my life. I had actually followed their incredibly condescending instructions with an absolute ruthless and unrelenting precision. I had dutifully rented a small, modest space. I had intentionally lived quietly in the shadows. But I had used the massive, compounding fortune they completely ignored to buy the very ground they walked on. Their breathtakingly cruel dismissal had instantly ignited a raging fire of ambition that completely and permanently incinerated their carefully fabricated world. As the cool, crisp city wind gently swept across the sprawling penthouse balcony, I took another slow, deeply satisfying sip of my champagne, simply basking in the flawless, undeniable perfection of my victory. Looking back on the massive, incredible empire I had meticulously built from the ground up, I finally realized the profound, beautiful irony of my long journey. Being told by them to just go and rent somewhere was without a single shred of doubt the absolute greatest piece of financial advice my parents had ever accidentally given to me. Looking back on everything that happened, the greatest lesson I learned is that rejection is often just redirection in disguise. When my parents told me to simply go rent a studio, they thought they were putting me in my place. Instead, they handed me the ultimate gift of absolute freedom. They severed the emotional strings that tied my ambition to their conditional approval. I learned that you do not need to fight for a seat at a table where you are not respected. You just need to walk away and build your own table. Too many of us waste our energy trying to prove our worth to people who are committed to misunderstanding us. We argue, we plead, and we present evidence of our value, hoping they will finally see us. But true power lies in silence. True financial and emotional independence means operating without the need for external applause. Let them underestimate you. Let them project their own insecurities onto your quiet life. While they are busy maintaining a fragile facade, you can focus on building an unshakable foundation. Family is supposed to be a safe harbor, but sharing DNA does not give anyone the right to steal your future or diminish your dreams. Setting firm boundaries is not an act of cruelty, it is an act of radical self-love. Sometimes the only way to protect your peace is to let toxic people face the full devastating weight of their own consequences. Have you ever had to silently build your own success while dealing with a family that constantly underestimated you? How did you finally take back your power? Share your story in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories about reclaiming your independence. Remember that your worth is never determined by those who refuse to see it.